The 19th Psalm, in verses 1 through 4, the psalmist says, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. Day unto day utters speech, and night unto night reveals knowledge. There is no speech nor language where their voice is not heard. Their line has gone out through all the world, and their words to the end of the world." My topic tonight is natural revelation, and specifically that means the revealing of God's nature, or the revealing of God himself through nature as a response to atheism relative to the theme of this meeting. Another way to speak of natural revelation is this, that if the universe is indeed a product of creation, then we should expect to see in it the fingerprints of a creator. And we believe that's what the Bible certainly declares. The Bible tells us in a number of passages that God is the creator of all things, including the universe at large and the earth and all of mankind and all of nature and all of the intricacies of the world. And so I want to take a few minutes to begin this evening to point out to you some passages of Scripture, some of which probably are familiar to you, that declare God's presence in the creation. The first one is probably, or I think at least one of the most controversial statements in history. Genesis chapter 1 and verse 1 says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." Psalm 33 and verse 6 says, "By the word of the Lord the heavens were of old, and all the host of them by the breath of his mouth." In Psalm 102, verse 25, the psalmist said, "Of old you have laid the foundation of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands." And Amos chapter 4 and verse 13 says, "Behold, he who forms mountains and creates the wind, the Lord God of hosts is his name." And then when we come to the New Testament revelation in the book of Romans chapter 1 and verse 20, the Bible says, "For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse." These are a few of the passages that declare God's presence or God's participation and God's involvement in the origin of all things we call the creation or the universe. Now then, there is one undeniable fact, therefore, that every person must contend with, grapple with, or answer, and that is, the universe is here, and we are here. And the question then becomes, how shall we account for this? There must be an answer. That brings me to the second point that I want to call your attention to tonight, and that is the atheist's dilemma. Now, I realize they think that we have some dilemmas, but I'm going to point out the atheist's dilemma, at least one of them. Since the atheist does not believe in God, therefore, he or she must somehow explain how things came to be the way they are, how the universe came about, where did it come from, where did we come from, and how did we get here? It seems to me that the atheist ultimately has only two possible answers to this question. I think probably any response that might be given to this question could be subsumed in one way or another under these two headings. One, he may affirm, first of all, that the universe is eternal, that there was no beginning ever, that everything that we now see has always been and always will be, although that still would not account for how it got here. Number two, the other possibility is that there was a beginning. However, all things that came into being at the beginning came into being out of nothing and with nothing causing it to come into being. More popularly, this idea is often expressed like this: no one brought something out of nothing. Well, let's take a minute tonight to examine these and think about these and some of their implications. First of all, let's consider number one on the screen: the universe is eternal. You know, this was the view of secularists for centuries, all the way back to the time of the Greeks the Greeks, and the Greek philosopher Aristotle himself in the 4th century BC also believed that the universe was eternal, that it was static. That is, that it did not change, but that it was essentially how it had always been and how it would always be. And this view was held all the way through the centuries, down through the stream of time, actually unto the 20th century. Because in 1915, this was turned on its ear when the man by the familiar name of Albert Einstein applied his theory of relativity to the universe. Now, I don't understand exactly how he did that, I can tell you today. But since that time, other scientists and physicists have been accumulating more and more evidence that there is a beginning to the universe. Einstein's theory of relativity, so I'm told by those who know, established the fact that the universe was not static and unchanging, but that it actually had been changing, and actually those changes pointed to a beginning point. Thus, option number 1, the universe is eternal, is not really an option. So the atheist must turn to option 2. Now, I say it's not an option because science is the atheist's God. And since science, the predominant position on science today is the universe had a beginning, therefore the atheist is forced, I think, to the second option, and that is that it had some kind of beginning, but that in order for it to begin, it sprang out of nothing. Again, the popular way to say that is no one brought something out of nothing. Well, this suggestion flies in the face of all known science on its own score. Even 260 years ago, the skeptic David Hume wrote, "I never asserted so absurd a proposition as that anything might arise without a cause." Translation, there is nothing so absurd as to think that anything can come into being from nothing all of its own power. However, this universally recognized fact, that is, that things do not just spring into existence, this universally recognized fact has not kept at least a few scientists from working to develop theories attempting to prove the contrary, that something can come from nothing. I don't know much about this, but again, I read from those who do. And those who do say that some scientists have postulated the existence of something they call theoretical virtual particles arising from theoretical quantum vacuums, neither of which are really known to exist, it's all theoretical, and then in order to explain or use those things to explain how something came from nothing. But the problem is that even if the universe did spring from virtual particles and quantum vacuums, we are still led back to that haunting question of infinite regress. Where did the quantum vacuum and the virtual particles come from? Now, in my lesson tonight, I've been asked to say a little bit about the cosmological argument for the existence of God. And I'll tell you tonight, I'm not a philosopher, and I don't pretend to be one, but this seems like a good time to introduce the cosmological argument for the existence of God. This actually originated in theological circles in the Middle Ages. So I confess that I'm a little hesitant to become enmeshed in the intricacies of formal logical argumentation, but I'm going to state a couple of sentences and then I'm going to go on. Essentially, the cosmological argument, please bear with me, is stated in the form of a syllogism, where when the major and minor premises are valid, sound, and true, the conclusion is inevitably true. Now, we demonstrate it like this. The major premise of the cosmological argument is this: whatever begins to exist has a cause. Stay with me. Minor premise: the universe had a beginning, and thus the conclusion. If these premises are true, valid, and sound as a structure of the syllogism, then the conclusion must be true. And the conclusion is, therefore, the universe had a cause. And the cause is a matter of question, but something caused it. Or might we say someone caused the universe or made the universe. Now let me make this simple. Number one, the major premise. whatever begins to exist has a cause. Now that sounds really technical, but let's make it simple. The old classic argument here is the watch and its maker. I'd like to modernize that to the iPhone. The iPhone is an item which has a beginning. It is a matter of man's devising. It is an intricately functioning item that does not simply begin to exist without a cause. It is designed by someone. Now, number two, the minor premise, the universe had a beginning. The universe had a beginning. In other words, in the same way as a cell phone, on a much larger scale, an intimately functioning universe came into being at some point. And we've already established that even science now predominantly recognizes some form of beginning to the universe. Now then, this leads to the conclusion. If these premises are correct, valid, sound, and true, then the result, the conclusion is the universe must have a cause. It must have a maker. Now, the question then becomes, what was or who was that cause? Well, first, the maker or the cause of the universe must be one who is distinct and separate from the universe itself. The maker cannot be part of the universe, because if the maker is part of the universe, then you have the universe creating itself, which still does not explain where the first part of the universe that did the making of the second part of the universe came from. You must have a beginning. Now, the cell phone and its creator are not one and the same. Steve Jobs and his iPhones are separate entities. I emphasize that not to sound technical, but because it is important, and we'll hold that idea in view as we proceed. Here's the related concept. God, like Steve Jobs, is not a part of his cell phone, nor is his cell phone a part of him. God also is not part of his creation. He exists in eternity. He is not part of the creation, nor is he subject to the qualities and conditions of that creation. He is not limited to the time-space continuum that we call the universe, which is the same as saying that God himself does not partake in beginnings and endings, but that he inhabits eternity. That is the cause described in the Bible. And those characteristics I've just described we'll come back to. But second, in identifying the cause of the universe, according to the conclusion of the cosmological argument, is that the maker must be immensely intelligent. You know, modern science as we know it today began about 500 years ago during the Renaissance. And over that 500 years, I suppose you could count up all the people in the realm of science in every angle and every area of scientific research have been accounting and accumulating evidence for centuries now. I suppose those people would number the millions, perhaps, over time. And these are very intelligent and inquiring people. And yet, even though there is a mass of scientific knowledge known today that has simply accumulated and built upon itself over 5 centuries, do you realize that all of that knowledge that is accumulated today is only a fraction, not even a measurable fraction, of the information that is yet out there available to be found? This speaks to the fact that the Creator, the cause of the universe, according to this conclusion, is a maker that is highly and immensely intelligent. Third, the maker must be immensely powerful. Do I need to argue that? Look at the universe, look at all that is out there and all of its complexities and its wonder and its beauty. And it's evident that the maker is a powerful one indeed. Now, I know I'm making a bit of a logical leap here, and I realize that, what I'm getting ready to say, but I only have 30 minutes. The God of the Bible meets all 3 criteria: distinct and separate from the creation, immensely intelligent, and immensely powerful. Now, I'm going to come back to that Creator in a moment, but I want to call your attention to something that I have noticed out there in the world today, and maybe you have too, and if you haven't, once I point it out to you, you may notice it sometime. I want to answer what I think is one of the common replies to the cosmological argument, one of the replies that attempts to discredit this point of view. It is this. Someone says, well, If everything that exists has a cause, then who caused God? Who made God? You may have seen this on a bumper sticker. And this is what I say. If you haven't noticed this, you might now, because I've seen them in more than one place. The bumper sticker, some may have T-shirts that say, "Who made God?" And if you see a bumper sticker that says, "Who made God?" that person, the driver of that car, may not know it, but that person is actually challenging the major premise of the cosmological argument. This person is trying to say that the cosmological argument does not prove the existence of God, because all it does is demonstrate the fact that everything traces back to a beginning and a maker, and therefore the maker that made everything was himself also made. Therefore it's an absurdity. Therefore there is no God. The problem with this, however, is this, that they are incorrectly assuming what the major premise is, and I'll put it back up there in a moment. I'll come back to it. But they basically are assuming this. Here's what they're assuming, that everything that exists has a cause. And that's not the argument. The question, who made God, does not reply to the major premise, because the major premise is everything that begins to exist has a cause. Now, when we come back to the fact that God is the creator of the universe, let me repeat what I said earlier. God is not a part of the creation. Therefore, all of the conditions and circumstances and characteristics of the creation do not apply to God. Beginnings and endings, time and space are all limited to the creation. Just like Steve Jobs does not match and equal his own cell phone, the two are not identical, so God is not a part of his creation. The concept of beginning to exist only applies to the creation and not the creator. Therefore, the question, who made God, sidesteps the issue and poses an irrelevant question, even though it appears to be very clever and appears to completely destroy this argument. Now then, I've said enough about the cosmological argument this evening. I will say, though, however, that although the cosmological argument is not a biblical argument per se, strictly speaking, it is nevertheless, as far as I'm able to tell, logically, scientifically, and even biblically sound, valid, and true. Now that I've talked about the Creator and referred to the creation, and we've gone through a lot of things that are a little technical, and I apologize if it seemed to meander about. What I want to do tonight is spend the rest of my time talking about the Creator and the fact that there are features about the creation that declare the presence of the Creator. I want to begin with this. The Creator, the heavens declare a Creator. We already read that in the earlier part of the lesson, but I'll read it again. Psalm 19, verses 1 through 6. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. I like the word handiwork. It suggests the intricate and carefully planned and purposed adornment, decoration. Verse 2. Day unto day utters speech, and night unto night reveals knowledge. There is no speech nor language where their voice is not heard. Their line has gone throughout all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. If you haven't pondered this beautiful psalm, do so sometime, for the structure of it is perfect Hebrew poetry with very balanced parallelism. But aside from all of that literary analysis, the beauty of this language and the import of it is significant. It declares that as people all over this globe, in all nations, all lands, all countries, tribes, and cultures and civilizations, gaze into the heavens and view the celestial tapestry that hangs above our head before our view, it portrays the power and glory of a Creator. It was with this wonder before him that even the psalmist long ago asked this question in Psalm 8, verses 3 and 4. When I consider the heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have ordained, what is man that you are mindful of him, and the Son of Man that you visit him? You know, I've heard people sometimes say, look how large the universe is. We cannot comprehend how vast the universe is. And sometimes unbelievers are heard to say, well, given the size of the universe and how that the earth and our existence here below is simply an infinitesimal speck in the midst of it all, dust on a vast landscape. Why would God even pay attention to us down here, even if he was the God of the universe, even if he did exist? You know, I think they don't even realize that even a biblical writer asked the same question. That man back there, the psalmist in Psalm 8, he didn't know how large the universe is. I don't know. I don't think he did, in the sense that we're able to know today by the discoveries that have been made, but he still asked the same question. And I don't think that question has changed. I think the question's still important. But the psalmist wasn't asking it skeptically. The psalmist was asking it to emphasize the fact of what a wonderful God it is that would look down, even in spite of the vastness of the universe, and yet still observe and care for humankind. But number two, the human body proclaims a creator. Psalm 139, verses 14 and 15 says, I will praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are your works, and that my soul knows very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in secret and skillfully wrought in the lowest parts of the earth. As we expect from the Psalms, it's a very poetic statement. The lower parts of the earth is a figure of speech to refer to the womb. The womb is a place where eyes don't behold, a place of darkness. It's like the lower parts of the earth. And the psalmist is saying that as my body was formed in that darkness, that was the place where God did more of his handiwork. The phrase skillfully wrought, I like what Albert Barnes says about this. He says the Hebrew word properly refers to the act of weaving in various threads. The reference here is to the various and complicated tissues of the human frame, Barnes says. The tendons, nerves, veins, arteries, muscles, as if they had been woven or as they appear to be curiously interweaved. No work of tapestry can compare with this. No work of man could weave together such a variety of most tender and delicate fibers and tissues as those which go to make up the human frame, even if they were made ready to his hand. And who but God can make them? I like what Barnes says because he says it so much better than I could. But thirdly, and lastly tonight, I call your attention to one more aspect of the creation that demonstrates the power of God and the Creator. And that is the human mind and consciousness speaks of a Creator. You know, the human mind, or what we would call our consciousness, our self-awareness, our self-consciousness, cannot be a product of mere biological forces. Naturalism, atheism, and scientific method have no explanation for the human mind, the self-awareness. In fact, Michael Ruse, a Darwinist philosopher, had this to say about this very point, and I think it's a pointed statement that he makes. Why should a bunch of atoms, he says, have thinking ability? Why should I, even as I write, be able to reflect on what I am doing, and why should you, even as you read, be able to ponder my points, agreeing or disagreeing, deciding to refute me or not? No one, he goes on, certainly not the Darwinian as such, seems to have an answer for this. The point is, he goes on, that there is no scientific explanation. Well, there's not a scientific explanation, because if a Darwinian will say there's no scientific explanation, I know there's not one, even though I'm not a scientist. Because if there was a scientific explanation for how the human mind exists and is cognizant and conscious in every waking person on the earth, if a Darwinian doesn't have the answer from science and will not provide it, I know it doesn't exist. But I do know the Bible has an explanation. Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 and 27, then God said, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. God created man with a soul. And it is that soul, with its self-consciousness and the capacity to form concepts of right and wrong, that is the characteristic feature of being made in the image of God. We are the creatures on this planet that are able to have a conscience and to know and understand the difference between right and wrong, even though a lot of people have what is right and wrong very mixed up because their conscience is not educated according to the truth of God. The fact is, many people, even the atheist, recognizes some kind of difference between right and wrong. And it is the capacity of the soul. It is the mind of man that enables him or her to do this. This concept is expressed elsewhere, even in the book of Genesis, thus, chapter 2 and verse 7. And the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. Such a statement is not made of the lower animals. While it seems that the lower animals have some form of consciousness, it is clear that they do not have the capacity that the human being does, and thus the human being is the crown of the creation. Thus is the human being was the result of his creation was when God said, very good. Now then, there are some very enthusiastic scientists who envision a day when computers will someday become so advanced and complex that the computer itself will have consciousness like human beings. But the philosopher Robert Argos and physicist George Stansui has this to say about that. I feel like they're probably better qualified to speak about this than I am. They say physics, neuroscience, and humanistic psychology all converge on the same principle. Mind is not reducible to matter. Let me expound on that. That is to say, consciousness is not just cells operating. It is not cerebral matter in operation. It is not the firing of synapses in the brain. And if that is true, then consciousness can never be made by man to arise from wires, plastic, hard drives, and lines of computer code. No matter how complex, no matter how advanced they may be in the year 2500, should that day come. These two authors I just alluded to also added this: the vain expectation that matter might someday account for mind is like the medieval alchemist's dream of producing gold from lead. I think that's a great statement. It's essentially affirming it's not going to happen. Yes, you see, my friends, the phenomenon of the human mind points to a divine mind. The fact that we have a mind that is not a function of matter, it is not a function of our brain cells, but that is something on a higher level than that, implies, by the same token that the universe has a cause, that that mind also has a cause. If the cause of the mind is not the brain cells, then there is some other cause for the mind. And it must be a divine mind that is the cause of it. Well, I close with Romans 1 and verse 20. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse.